Listen with absolute attention, because what I'm about to reveal is the single most important obstacle between you and genuine spiritual awakening, a reality so significant that Rudolf Steiner devoted extensive teaching to it, warning that anyone attempting serious inner development will inevitably encounter what he called the guardian of the threshold, an entity, a being, a presence that stands at the boundary between ordinary consciousness and higher spiritual perception, blocking passage. Until you've proven yourself worthy, until you've developed the strength and moral clarity to handle what lies beyond. This is not metaphor, not symbolic language for psychological processes, though it includes those, but is actual encounter with autonomous force that you must meet, if you pursue consciousness development beyond superficial spirituality into the depths where real transformation occurs. And here's what makes this teaching so crucial. Most people attempting spiritual development have no idea this encounter is coming, are completely unprepared for its devastating intensity, and either flee back to comfortable unconsciousness, or worse, try to bypass it, creating the spiritual inflation and delusion that characterizes so much of modern spirituality. The closest scientific framework for understanding this comes from depth psychology's recognition of threshold experiences in consciousness transformation. Research on psychedelic experiences by researchers like Stanislav Grof documents encounters with what subjects describe as guardian figures, beings, or presences that appear during profound, altered states, sometimes terrifying, always significant, that must be faced before deeper experiences can occur. Studies on intensive meditation retreats show that practitioners regularly encounter what Buddhist traditions call maras, or obstacles, psychological crises that emerge when practice deepens beyond a certain point. Research on the stages of spiritual development by James Fowler and others recognizes that transitions between stages typically involve crisis, breakdown of previous worldview, encounter with material that threatens existing sense of self. But Steiner's teaching penetrates far beyond what psychology can measure. He distinguished between two guardians, the lesser guardian, which is essentially your own shadow made visible, all the denied, repressed, unintegrated aspects of yourself consolidated into a single terrifying presence. And the greater guardian, which is something else entirely, a cosmic being whose function is to test whether your individual consciousness has developed sufficiently to handle the vast spiritual realities that exist beyond the threshold. Every authentic spiritual tradition describes similar encounters, though using different terminology. In Tibetan Buddhism, the wrathful deities of the bardo, those terrifying figures that appear after death, are actually your own mind's projections that you must recognize as such to achieve liberation. In Egyptian initiation, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at is the moment where you're judged worthy or unworthy to pass into higher realms. In Greek mysteries, the descent into the underworld required facing Cerberus, the three-headed guardian dog. Every path that leads anywhere real has a guardian, a test, a threshold that cannot be bypassed, only faced. The signs that you're approaching the threshold are unmistakable. Once you know what to look for, though terrifying, if you don't understand what's happening. Your spiritual practice that was progressing smoothly suddenly becomes difficult. Meditation that was peaceful becomes disturbed by intrusive thoughts or disturbing visions. Dreams become more intense, often nightmarish, filled with threatening figures. Synchronicities increase but take on dark quality, seeing symbols of death everywhere. Your psychological material that you thought was integrated begins surfacing with new intensity, old wounds reopening. You might experience what spiritual traditions call dark night, where everything that gave meaning collapses. This is the guardian beginning to manifest, and these experiences are not signs you're doing something wrong, but signs you're finally getting somewhere real, finally reaching the depth where genuine transformation begins, rather than just playing at spirituality on the surface where it's safe and comfortable and changes nothing fundamental about who you are. Now we descend into the specific nature of the lesser guardian, and what Steiner reveals will disturb you precisely because it's true. This guardian is you, or rather it's everything you've refused to acknowledge as you, the parts of yourself you've denied, repressed, hidden from consciousness, all consolidated into a single horrifying presence that confronts you at the threshold like a living mirror reflecting back everything you've spent your life pretending you're not. Every lie you've told yourself, every quality you've projected onto others and judged harshly, every impulse you've deemed unacceptable, every wound you've refused to feel, every darkness you've insisted doesn't exist in you. All of this material that you've spent years or decades pushing into the basement of consciousness suddenly appears before you as an autonomous entity, forcing you to see what you've actually become through your systematic self-deception and denial. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and his work validates Steiner's teaching from a psychological angle, though Jung's understanding, profound as it was, didn't reach the full spiritual dimensions that Steiner perceived. Jung documented how the unconscious consolidates denied material into autonomous complexes that can appear in dreams, fantasies, or be projected onto others, creating this phenomenon where you see your own unacknowledged qualities in other people and react to them with disproportionate intensity. Studies on repression by researchers following Freud and Jung show that suppressed material doesn't disappear, but gains power in the unconscious, influencing behavior, creating symptoms, distorting perception. Research on shadow projection demonstrates that the qualities you most vehemently judge in others are typically disowned parts of yourself, that your harsh judgments reveal what you cannot accept in yourself. The lesser guardian is the sum total of your shadow, and it appears at the threshold because spiritual development requires integration of the whole self, not just the parts you approve of, not just the light, but also the darkness, not just the qualities you're proud of, but also those you're ashamed of. You cannot access higher consciousness while remaining fragmented, while parts of you operate unconsciously, while your shadow controls you from behind the scenes, sabotaging your efforts, creating the very problems you consciously oppose. The guardian forces integration by making the shadow visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore or project away. What you see in this encounter is not pretty. It's everything you fear you are, everything you've worked to prove you're not, all your ugliness, your cruelty, your weakness, your pettiness, your darkness reflected back with terrible clarity that admits no rationalization or excuse. Most people flee from this sight, cannot bear to see themselves so nakedly, return to the comfortable illusion of being only their idealized self-image, only their light. But those who have the courage to face it, to stand before this monstrous reflection and say, yes, this too is me, to own it without being destroyed by shame, to integrate it without acting it out, these rare individuals pass the first test and discover something extraordinary. That the monster loses its power when acknowledged, that the shadow integrated becomes strength rather than sabotage, that wholeness requires accepting the totality of what you are, light and dark together, and that this acceptance is the foundation for genuine transformation rather than just improvement of the persona you present to the world. Let me show you exactly how the guardian is constructed, brick by brick, from the raw material of your unlived life, your unprocessed trauma, your habitual patterns and compulsive behaviors, because understanding the anatomy of this monster is essential for recognizing how you've been building it your entire life, probably without even realizing it. Steiner taught that every uncontrolled desire, every compulsive behavior, every fear you've avoided facing, every moral failing you've excused or rationalized, every time you've chosen comfort over truth or convenience over integrity, contributes to building the guardian, adding substance to it, making it more formidable, more terrifying. Think of it as energy you've invested in denying parts of reality, and that energy doesn't dissipate into nothing but accumulates, takes form, becomes the barrier between you and awakening. Your addiction to validation from others becomes the guardian's voice telling you you're worthless without approval. Your repressed rage, all the anger you've swallowed rather than expressing appropriately, becomes its threatening presence, its violent aspect. Your sexual shame, everything you've judged as dirty or wrong about your desires, becomes its seductive or repulsive form. Your fear of death, the existential terror you've avoided through constant distraction, becomes the void it threatens you with. Every vice you've indulged becomes a feature of the monster. Every fear you've fed makes it larger. Every lie you've told yourself gives it more substance. The guardian is literally made of your denied shadow, your unintegrated trauma, your compulsive patterns that operate beneath conscious awareness. Neuroscience of habit formation shows that repeated behaviors create neural pathways that operate automatically below conscious control, which is why you do things you consciously don't want to do, why you repeat patterns you swore you'd break. Research on trauma demonstrates that unprocessed experiences get stored in fragmented form in the body and unconscious, emerging as symptoms, flashbacks, or compulsive reenactments. Studies on addiction reveal how compulsive behaviors hijack normal reward systems, creating dependencies that control you rather than you controlling them. All of this psychological and neurological material contributes to the guardian's substance, but Steiner's vision goes deeper into the karmic dimension that science cannot measure. Material from past lives, unresolved patterns carried forward across incarnations, debts unpaid, lessons unlearned, harm caused that hasn't been balanced, all of this also consolidates in the guardian. The creature you face is not just this lifetime's shadow, but the accumulated shadow of your entire soul's journey across multiple incarnations, which is why it's so overwhelming, why it feels impossible to face, because it is the sum of everything you've denied across lifetimes, finally demanding to be seen, integrated, resolved. This is the terrifying truth. Every time you avoid facing your shadow in this life, you're making the guardian stronger, adding to what you'll have to face either at the threshold or after death in the Bardo realms. But understanding this anatomy also reveals hope. The guardian can be made smaller, less formidable, through conscious work on yourself before the encounter, through facing your fears gradually, integrating your shadow piece by piece, living with integrity and truth. Now we confront the devastating truth about why most people fail at the threshold, turn back, settle for superficial spirituality, rather than face what the Guardian reveals. And this understanding is crucial because it will show you exactly what you're up against if you choose to continue on the path of genuine awakening. The terror is not of some external demon or evil force, not of hellfire or punishment, but of something far more intimate and unbearable. Seeing yourself with absolute clarity, without any of the defenses, rationalizations, or self-deceptions that normally protect your self-image, without any of the comfortable illusions you've constructed about who you are and what you're doing here. Steiner understood what modern psychology is only beginning to grasp, that the ego will do almost anything, will sacrifice almost everything, to avoid confronting its own non-existence, its constructed nature, the terrifying gap between who you think you are and what you actually are beneath all the personas and performances. Research on cognitive dissonance by Leon Festinger shows that people will twist reality, deny clear evidence, create elaborate justifications, rather than admit they were wrong about something central to their self-concept. Studies on self-deception demonstrate the elaborate mechanisms the mind uses to maintain preferred narratives, filtering perception, rewriting memory, rationalizing behavior, all to preserve the story of who you believe yourself to be. The Guardian strips all this away in a single devastating moment of clarity, forces you to see the truth about yourself, and the truth, when seen completely without defense, is annihilating to the false self you've spent your life constructing and maintaining. You see your selfishness masquerading as generosity, your manipulation disguised as love, your fear pretending to be strength, your spiritual seeking itself revealed as just another form of ego aggrandizement, another way of trying to feel special, superior, more evolved than others. You see how you've hurt people while believing yourself kind, how you've been dishonest while claiming integrity, how you've remained unconscious and reactive while thinking yourself awake and aware. You see the gap between your ideals and your actions, between who you pretend to be and who you've actually been, and this gap is a chasm that swallows your entire sense of self. This level of radical honesty is excruciating, feels like death, because it is death, the death of the illusion of who you thought you were, the death of the carefully constructed self-image you've defended your entire life. Most people simply cannot bear it. The pain is too intense, the blow to the ego too devastating. They flee back to comfortable unconsciousness, convince themselves the Guardian was just psychological disturbance or meditation-induced hallucination, return to spiritual practices that don't threaten their ego structure, practices that make them feel good without requiring them to face the darkness, teachings that promise enlightenment without demanding the death of who they think they are. This is why genuine awakening is rare, why most spiritual seekers remain seekers indefinitely, accumulating experiences and knowledge and practices, but never actually crossing the threshold that would transform them, circling around the Guardian, but never facing it, choosing the comfort of familiar suffering over the terror of transformation. The price of passage is simply too high for most people. Total honesty, complete self-confrontation, absolute surrender of the false self, the willingness to see yourself as you actually are rather than as you wish to be, and to continue standing there in that seeing without collapsing into self-hatred or fleeing into denial. If you survive the Lesser Guardian, if you somehow find the courage and honesty to face your shadow completely, to integrate all the denied and repressed aspects of yourself, to stand naked in the truth of what you are and accept it, you might think the hard part is over, that you've passed the test and can now access the higher spiritual realities you've been seeking. But Steiner reveals something that stops most initiates dead in their tracks. There is a second Guardian, the Greater Guardian. And this one is not your personal shadow, not the accumulated darkness of your individual existence, but is a cosmic being, an actual spiritual entity of such vast magnitude and power that your entire individual consciousness seems like a candle flame before a hurricane, a being whose function is to test whether you're truly ready for direct perception of spiritual realities. This Guardian doesn't show you what you've denied about yourself, but rather reveals the gap between your current development and what's required to handle higher consciousness without being destroyed by it. Meeting the Greater Guardian is like standing at the edge of an abyss, a void so vast that your individual ego disappears into it like a drop into an ocean. And the question is whether you can maintain consciousness in the face of your own cosmic insignificance, whether you can bear the knowledge of how small you are while simultaneously recognizing your eternal nature. Research on mystical experiences by researchers like Walter Pahnke and Roland Griffiths documents encounters with what subjects describe as overwhelming presence, divine intelligence, or cosmic consciousness that makes individual self seem utterly insignificant, experiences that can be both ecstatic and terrifying. The Greater Guardian is Steiner's name for the spiritual reality that tests whether your ego has dissolved sufficiently, not just whether you've integrated your shadow, but whether you've transcended identification with the personal self altogether, whether you've developed the moral strength and spiritual perception adequate for what lies beyond, whether you can maintain consciousness in the presence of forces and realities that would annihilate ordinary awareness. This guardian doesn't threaten or seduce like the lesser guardian can, doesn't play on your personal fears and desires, but simply exists in such overwhelming magnitude that you either have the strength and development to stand before it, or you don't. And if you don't, you're simply turned back, not as punishment, but as protection, because what lies beyond would shatter you if you're not ready. Many who pass the lesser guardian fail here, their personal shadow integrated, but their spiritual development insufficient for the cosmic dimension, their individual consciousness capable of facing its own darkness, but not yet able to bear the light of direct spiritual perception. Steiner taught that preparation for this encounter requires years, often decades, of disciplined practice, developing specific capacities, the ability to maintain consciousness without ego support, without the usual references and structures that give you sense of who you are, moral intuition that operates without external rules or authority, arising from direct spiritual perception of what's right, capacity to perceive spiritual realities directly rather than just thinking about them, and the strength to bear knowledge that shatters ordinary understanding of reality. The test of the Greater Guardian is not whether you can defeat it or outwit it, but whether you can simply endure its presence, accept your own relative insignificance in the cosmic scheme while simultaneously recognizing your participation in the eternal, hold both your smallness and your divinity simultaneously without collapsing into either inflation or despair. Now, I'll give you the specific markers, the unmistakable signs that you're approaching the threshold and the Guardian is beginning to manifest in your experience, and you need to pay close attention to these symptoms because recognizing them allows you to prepare consciously, rather than being blindsided by an encounter you don't understand. First, your spiritual practice changes quality dramatically, often suddenly. Meditation that was peaceful, perhaps even blissful, becomes disturbed by intrusive thoughts, disturbing imagery, sometimes actual visions of threatening figures or scenarios. What once felt like sanctuary becomes battleground. Second, your dreams intensify, becoming vivid, memorable, often nightmarish. You might dream repeatedly of being chased by monsters, standing before courts being judged, facing your death in various forms, encountering dark figures who feel malevolent or testing. These are not random anxiety dreams, but are your unconscious, preparing you for the threshold encounter, showing you in symbolic form what you'll face directly. Third, synchronicities increase, but take on distinctly dark quality. You see symbols of death, decay, snakes, darkness, the number 13, skulls, ravens, everywhere you look. Numbers or symbols that once felt spiritually meaningful now feel ominous, warning signs appearing in your path. Fourth, psychological material you thought was resolved, wounds you believed healed, patterns you were certain you'd transcended, all of this resurfaces with new and often greater intensity. Old addictions tempt you with renewed force, character defects you believed you'd overcome appear in exaggerated form. Childhood wounds reopen, sometimes feeling even more raw than when they first occurred. This is the Guardian gathering its substance from your denied material, consolidating your shadow into confrontable form. Fifth, your relationships become mirrors reflecting exactly what you don't want to see about yourself. People around you suddenly seem to embody your worst qualities, trigger your deepest wounds, force you to face what you've been avoiding. This isn't coincidence, but is the universe conspiring to show you your shadow before the Guardian shows it to you directly. Sixth, you might experience what psychiatry calls depression, but what spiritual traditions recognize as the dark night. Loss of meaning, faith dissolving, everything you believed about yourself and reality coming into question, sense of abandonment by whatever divine presence you'd felt before, darkness that no amount of practice or positive thinking can dispel, because its function is to strip away your supports before the threshold. Research on spiritual emergency by Stanislav and Christina Grof documents exactly these symptoms as predictable stages in spiritual development rather than pathology requiring psychiatric intervention. Seventh, physical symptoms can appear: exhaustion despite adequate rest, illnesses that don't respond to medical treatment, body pain without identifiable physical cause, as if your body itself is preparing for ordeal. Eighth, and perhaps most distinctive, you sense a presence, particularly during solitary spiritual practice, a feeling of being watched, waited for, tested, the sense that something immense is approaching and there's no way to avoid the encounter. You can only prepare for it or flee from it. These symptoms are not signs you're doing something wrong, not evidence you should stop practicing or seek medication. but are signs you're finally going deep enough to reach the threshold where real transformation begins, rather than remaining safely on the surface, where spiritual practice changes nothing fundamental. Understanding that the guardian is inevitable if you're serious about spiritual development, we turn to the practical question that may determine whether you survive the encounter or are destroyed by it. How do you prepare? Steiner was explicit that certain capacities must be developed before attempting to cross the threshold, and he warned that attempting to force the encounter prematurely, before you've done the preparatory work, is not just ineffective, but genuinely dangerous, potentially, leading to psychological breakdown, spiritual inflation, or possession by the very forces you're trying to transcend. First, and most fundamental, you must establish unwavering commitment to truth in all things, practicing radical honesty not just in your speech, but in your perception of yourself and reality. Notice where you lie to yourself, where you distort or rationalize or make excuses, and work systematically to eliminate self-deception, because the guardian tests whether you can face truth without flinching. And if you've been lying to yourself all along, the sudden confrontation with truth will shatter you. Second, develop emotional stability and equanimity through regular daily practice, because encountering the guardian while you're emotionally reactive or unstable is like trying to perform surgery during an earthquake, impossible and catastrophic. Meditation, particularly practices that develop witness consciousness and emotional regulation, is essential. Steiner's own exercises for developing equanimity, the capacity to meet both joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, success and failure with equal consciousness, directly prepare you for standing before the guardian without being overwhelmed. Third, engage systematic shadow work, using therapy, self-inquiry, active imagination, or other methods to consciously integrate your denied material before the guardian consolidates it into overwhelming form. Every piece of shadow you integrate consciously is one less weapon the guardian can use against you, one less aspect that will terrify you in the encounter. Fourth, strengthen your moral foundation not through following rules, but through developing what Steiner called moral intuition, the capacity to perceive directly what's right in each situation. Practice ethical living not because you're supposed to, but because you've developed sensitivity to the effects of your actions, because you can feel the karmic consequences, because you genuinely care about not causing harm. The guardian tests your moral development, and if you've been spiritually bypassing ethics, using spiritual concepts to excuse harmful behavior, you will fail this test. Fifth, establish regular practice of Steiner's 6 basic exercises or equivalent practices from other traditions that develop specific soul capacities: control of thinking, control of will, positivity, open-mindedness, faith, and inner balance. These aren't just nice ideas, but are actual capacities you build like muscles through consistent practice. Sixth, find a teacher or guide who has crossed the threshold themselves, who can recognize where you are in the process and help you navigate what's coming, because attempting this alone, without guidance from someone who has walked the path before you, dramatically increases the danger. Seventh, prepare yourself psychologically and spiritually for what may be the hardest thing you ever face, understanding that this is not exaggeration or dramatic language, but is accurate description of an ordeal that will test every aspect of your being. And that while the guardian is ultimately a compassionate function ensuring you don't access realities you can't handle, the experience of the encounter is anything but comfortable. It is in fact devastating to everything you think you are, which is precisely why it's necessary for genuine transformation to occur. Now we enter territory that can barely be described in words, because the actual passage through this guardian is so uniquely personal, so dependent on your specific psychology and karma, that any description is necessarily incomplete. But I'll share what Steiner taught, and what the mystery traditions have preserved about this crucial moment. The encounter itself often happens when you least expect it. Not necessarily during formal practice, but sometimes in dream, in crisis, in moment of complete surrender when you've stopped trying to force anything and have simply accepted whatever comes. You find yourself facing the guardian in whatever form your unconscious has constructed from your shadow material, and the terror is absolute, total, beyond anything you've previously experienced, because you're facing literally everything you fear you are, everything you've denied, everything you've run from consolidated into single overwhelming presence. What happens next determines everything. If you flee, try to escape, deny what you're seeing, attack the guardian as if it's external enemy, you fail the test and are turned back, the threshold remaining closed, and you return to ordinary consciousness, perhaps convinced the whole thing was just bad dream or meditation-induced hallucination, but something in you knows you failed, and the guardian will have to be faced again later, in this life or another. If you try to bargain with it, negotiate, make promises about how you'll be better if it just lets you pass, you're still operating from ego's framework of deals and contracts, still trying to maintain control, and this too is failure. The only response that allows passage is complete acceptance, the willingness to face what the guardian shows you without defense, to own it fully as yours, to say, yes, this is what I am, this is what I've done, this is the truth about me, and to stand in that truth without collapsing into self-hatred or fleeing into denial. This acceptance is a kind of death, the death of the false self, the death of the idealized self-image you've maintained, the death of your defenses and rationalizations. And it feels like death, feels like annihilation, like you're being destroyed. Because you are. Everything you thought you were is being destroyed by the fire of truth. But if you can bear it, if you can stay conscious through this dying, something extraordinary happens. The guardian, which seemed so monstrous, begins to transform. The terrifying figure reveals itself as teacher, as ally, as the very force that was protecting you from premature spiritual experiences you weren't ready for. The shadow you've been fighting reveals itself as source of power, of creativity, of wholeness. Because what you've denied wasn't just your darkness, but often your light too, your power, your authenticity, everything that didn't fit the narrow identity you'd constructed. As you integrate what the guardian has shown you, accepting it fully, the threshold opens, and you find yourself in territory beyond ordinary consciousness, where spiritual realities become directly perceptible, where you see the world not just with physical eyes, but with what Steiner called spiritual organs of perception. But this isn't blissful escape from ordinary life, isn't transcendence that leaves the world behind, but rather is capacity to see and operate in both dimensions simultaneously, to function in ordinary reality while perceiving its spiritual dimensions, to be fully human while recognizing your divine nature. And you carry with you, forever after, the knowledge of what you faced and survived, the integration of your shadow that makes you whole rather than just good, authentic rather than just nice, genuinely powerful rather than just pretending strength. Now we must look unflinchingly at what happens when people attempt to cross the threshold without adequate preparation, because understanding these failures is essential for avoiding them, and because the wreckage left by premature spiritual experiences litters the landscape of modern spirituality, though it's rarely discussed openly. Steiner was explicit that forcing spiritual experiences before you're ready, trying to bypass the preparatory work, using drugs or extreme practices to blast through the threshold, is not just ineffective, but actively dangerous, potentially causing psychological damage, spiritual inflation that makes genuine development impossible, or possession by the very forces you're trying to transcend. The casualties of this approach are everywhere if you know what to look for. People who had powerful experiences through psychedelics or intense practices but couldn't integrate them, who returned to ordinary consciousness, fragmented, destabilized, unable to function normally. Research on adverse effects of meditation by Willoughby Britton and others documents. Meditation-induced psychological crises, including psychotic episodes, severe dissociation, depression, anxiety, that can occur when practice intensifies too quickly, or when people with unresolved trauma attempt advanced practices without proper foundation. Studies on spiritual emergency distinguish between spiritual emergence, which is the natural, if sometimes difficult unfolding of spiritual capacities, and spiritual emergency, which is crisis requiring intervention, and the distinction often hinges on whether the person has adequate preparation and support. The consequences of premature threshold encounter fall into several categories. First, complete psychological breakdown, where the ego structure shatters and cannot reform, resulting in psychosis or severe dissociation that may require hospitalization and psychiatric intervention. This is rare but real, documented in both traditional texts and modern research. Second, and more common, is spiritual inflation, where the person has some genuine spiritual experience but ego claims it, using spiritual attainment as new form of superiority, becoming insufferable in their certainty that they're enlightened, while their actual behavior shows no transformation, still selfish, still unconscious, still creating harm, but now armed with spiritual justification for it. Third is premature opening of psychic capacities without moral development or grounding, resulting in person who can perceive subtle energies or receive information, but lacks wisdom or ethics to use these capacities properly, often becoming manipulative or developing messianic delusions. Fourth is getting stuck in the encounter with the guardian, unable to fully face it, but unable to return to comfortable unconsciousness, caught in liminal space of perpetual crisis, dark night that doesn't resolve because they won't do the work of actual integration. Fifth is spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts and experiences to avoid dealing with psychological wounds, relationship problems, ethical failings, creating facade of spirituality, covering over unresolved human issues. Sixth is possession, where premature opening to spiritual dimensions without adequate protection allows negative or chaotic forces to influence or control consciousness, manifesting as compulsive behaviors, addictions, or genuine entity attachment. Steiner emphasized that these dangers are not meant to frighten people away from spiritual development, but to emphasize the necessity of proper preparation, of working with genuine teachers rather than trying to force experiences alone, of building foundation in ethics and emotional stability before attempting to access higher consciousness. The Guardian exists precisely to prevent these catastrophes, but people who try to bypass it through drugs or forced techniques circumvent this protection, opening themselves to experiences they cannot handle, and the results can be devastating and sometimes permanent. We arrive now at the culmination, the description of what awaits those rare individuals who successfully pass through the Guardian, who face their shadow completely and survive the death of the false self, who develop the strength and clarity and moral foundation to cross the threshold into direct spiritual perception. And what Steiner describes will either inspire you or terrify you, depending on whether you're ready for this level of responsibility and freedom. Because life beyond the Guardian is not the blissful escape from human existence that spiritual seekers often fantasize about, but is something far more demanding and far more real. The capacity to perceive and operate in spiritual dimensions while remaining fully engaged with ordinary life, to see the world as it actually is rather than through the filters of ego and conditioning, to act from genuine spiritual insight rather than following rules or reacting automatically, to be genuinely free while accepting total responsibility for that freedom. Those who cross the threshold report certain consistent changes. First, perception fundamentally shifts. You see the spiritual dimensions of physical reality directly not as belief or imagination, but as clear perception, seeing the life forces in nature, perceiving the emotional and soul qualities of people, recognizing synchronicities and spiritual laws operating beneath surface appearances. This isn't vague intuition, but is as clear as physical vision, what Steiner called spiritual organs of perception, developed through the preparatory work. Second, the nature of consciousness changes. You recognize yourself as awareness itself rather than as the content of consciousness, able to observe thoughts, emotions, sensations without being identified with them. Permanent witness consciousness that remains stable even through intense experiences. Third, and perhaps most significant, you're no longer driven by unconscious patterns, by shadow material operating beneath awareness, by compulsions and reactions you can't control, because you've integrated the shadow completely, making conscious what was unconscious. Fourth, you develop what Steiner called moral intuition, direct perception of what's right in each situation without needing to follow rules or consult authorities, because you can see the spiritual consequences of actions, understand karma not as belief, but as observable reality, perceive the web of connections and effects that each choice creates. Fifth, fear fundamentally transforms, not disappearing because fear serves valid functions, but the existential terror that drives most human behavior, the fear of death, of meaninglessness, of not being enough. This dissolves because you faced what you most feared in the Guardian encounter and survived, because you know directly that consciousness continues beyond death, that you're part of something vast and eternal. Sixth, relationships transform because you're no longer projecting shadow onto others, no longer needing them to complete you or validate you, able to see and relate to them as they actually are rather than as you need them to be. But with these capacities comes responsibility because you cannot unknow what you've learned, cannot unsee what you've seen, cannot return to comfortable unconsciousness even if you wanted to. You bear the burden of seeing clearly while living in a world where most people remain asleep, of knowing the spiritual realities while functioning in material dimensions, of having passed through death while still living in a body that will eventually die. Steiner emphasized that those who cross the threshold become servants whether they want to or not, their development obligating them to help others awaken, to work for the evolution of human consciousness, not from duty or obligation, but because, having seen what they've seen, having received what they've received, it becomes impossible to do anything else. This is the freedom beyond the Guardian. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom to respond. Not escape from life, but full engagement with life. Not transcendence of the human condition, but fulfillment of it. Becoming fully what human beings are meant to be, bridges between heaven and earth, consciousness that can perceive and operate in spiritual dimensions while remaining grounded in physical reality. Servants of the evolution that is driving all existence toward ever greater awareness. Ever deeper love, ever more complete integration of spirit and matter. This is what awaits beyond the Guardian for those brave enough to face it, strong enough to survive it, and wise enough to use what they've gained not for personal aggrandizement, but in service to the awakening of all consciousness everywhere.